So we kick things off with this quote from Jung. This is from Collected Works 12, Psychology and Alchemy. And he says, some 35 years ago, I noticed to my amazement that European and American men and women coming to me for psychological advice were producing in their dreams and fantasies symbols similar to and often identical with the symbols found in the mystery religions of antiquity, in mythology, folklore, fairy tales, and the apparently meaningless formulations of such esoteric cults as alchemy. Experience showed, moreover, that these symbols brought with them new energy and new life to the people to whom they came. So, like, the really big takeaway that I want you guys to get from this quote is that when these symbols, these repeating universal symbols, show up in an individual, they bring with them a kind of charge and energy and intensity, this well that we can kind of mine for potential new growth, insight, inspiration. And we're going to kind of get into why that might be. Why do these particular symbols, compared to maybe our individual or unique subjective symbols, why do these ones, in contrast, bring forth this sense of new energy and new life? So we're going to be answering that question. But first, a very quick exercise. So in continuation of this quote from Jung, so he's saying, he's in clinical practice, he's with patients. All of these interesting symbols are coming up that he's starting to notice repeat. And I think for the most part, what he noticed originally were mythic symbols. So things that he had read about in old ancient mythologies showing up in patients, both ones that had serious psychiatric disorders, but also in the everyday individual. And they had these highly symbolic, very mythic symbols. But there were some symbols that he was starting to receive from his patients that he didn't really understand. And one of them is that a patient dreamt that an eagle was flying through the sky and it turned around and began to bite its wing. And he didn't have an association for that. He couldn't link that to a particular mythology or a fairy tale or some other kind of esoteric quote. And it kind of stumped him, but there was a sense that there was something deeper in this dream image. Like, it felt quite archetypal in nature. And then sometime later, he came upon the Ripley scroll. This here that you see on the screen is just a section of the Ripley scroll. It's kind of this really long, vertical, illuminated manuscript. It's incredibly beautiful. And when he saw the Ripley scroll, he's like, "Oh my God, there it is. There's that image of the bird turning around and biting its own wing." And he started to realize in that experience and in others that the images and symbols in alchemical manuscripts were similar to those in mythology and in fairy tales and astrology, and how they were being produced in the individual of the modern day. So we see here an image of the Ripley scroll of the it's kind of crowned, almost like king-like figure, but is a bird. So it's this kind of hybrid creature. And just to sort of play with the imagination of this image, I would love you to share in the chat, how might you interpret this image if it came up in your dreams? What does it evoke for you? What ideas, maybe what keywords, not necessarily the deep meaning it would have exactly to your life, but if you saw this image and allowed the symbolism to kind of, move through you or draw something out of you without any other context, what comes up? And there are no wrong answers. So let's just get a sense. So drop your thoughts in the chat, whether it's a keyword or a sentence or an idea. The freedom and liberation coming up very much with the kind of winged bird creatures. We see a lot of these themes of expansiveness and their ability to go where they want to go. Yeah, like that, Effie. It initially looks like a figure trying to prevent its own flight if it's eating its wing, right? So the mechanism of movement, of getting from one place to another, of the power of directionality from the point of view of a bird, is of course their wings. That's their power. So why would this figure be preventing that? Why would it be biting its own wings? Why would it be handicapping itself? So it's an interesting thought. Oh, that's interesting, Richard. Yeah. Might see the symbol as pointing to how I could feed on my own internal resources more for growth. Yeah. I wish that I had an image of the pelican vessel where it's in a few different places. I think it's in Psychology and Alchemy. It's in one of Jung's books, but the alchemists used all of these different vessels that had all of these different shapes, and a lot of them were both, a practical, concrete material that they were using in their laboratory, but the shape of it and the kind of mindset that the alchemist was in brought forth fantasies and images and symbols. And so there was a particular kind of a distillation vessel called the pelican vessel, because what it looks like is like the body, perhaps maybe of a bird, and the way that it distills is like the material starts to float up, and then it goes through a little part of the vessel back down, and then there's a kind of condensed material that flows down that tube, and then it might circulate back. And so it looks like in the imagery, a pelican biting itself and kind of feeding into itself. And so that idea, Richard, at least reminds me of the pelican vessel. And it's very interesting to see how the alchemists took these very practical items and reimagined them. And that's such a huge part of why alchemy is so powerful as an inner work modality, because it straddles that realm. And we're going to get into that a little bit more. Okay. Thank you, everyone, for sharing your thoughts. Let's get into a little bit more of the theory. I always love to start classes this way, just so we ground ourselves in a little bit of the psychology and the theoretical framework to understand, what are we talking about, or what are the psychological mechanisms that might be at play here. So you've probably seen this model a lot, but I love to reference it. This is a Jungian diagram of the psyche. It's based off of one from his book, Consciousness and the Unconscious. And here we just see, in very loose terms, the different structures or layers of the psyche. And that bright outer layer is consciousness. That's the seat of the ego, our identity, what's accessible, our memories, thoughts, emotions, everything that we can readily access. But then as we go deeper below the surface of the psyche, we start to realize that there is this incredible, vast realm of unknown material. And from a Jungian perspective, that's broken into two layers. The first is the personal unconscious. We can think of this as most closely associated with the kind of classic psychoanalytic or Freudian idea where there's repressed memories here. There are parts of ourselves, traumas that we couldn't deal with, but from the Jungian perspective, the personal unconscious is more than just repressed drives or repressed traumas or things like that. It also is the home of the complexes. It's where there might be material that's developing that might readily become conscious, but it has this very subjective flavor to it. It's got a mixture of your memories, thoughts, emotions, feelings, things you can kind of explore into your personal root system. But then Jung postulated that there's something even deeper, this sort of generative dynamic core of the psyche that he calls the collective unconscious. And this is, I think, one of the most profound and most mysterious ideas that he has. We're going to get into that in a moment. But the idea really of inner work, or of individuation, this process of becoming whole, of becoming who we're meant to be, of guiding ourselves towards development, is to link the bright outer layer of consciousness or the ego into the deeper layers of the unconscious, both on the personal and